"Get out of here, you floor scrubber." That was what Chad hurled straight into Marcus's face. A black single father, right in the middle of a luxury cafe, in front of his daughter, in front of a crowd, frozen in dead silence. And just a few seconds later, another hand was raised, not to strike, but to sign. A deaf woman standing at the end of the counter, treated with no less contempt. Marcus turned back, clumsily signing a small joke, and the entire room fell completely silent. The woman burst into radiant laughter. The atmosphere flipped instantly, but very few people knew that that smile was the fuse. Because that woman was not an ordinary customer. She was the chief executive officer of the corporation preparing to crush Marcus. And that edited video clip, it was not an accident, but the beginning of a manhunt. If you were Marcus, humiliated, having the truth twisted, with your child needing medication to survive, would you bow your head just to stay alive? Or stand up and drag the entire system down with you? Comment your choice. Follow and subscribe to the channel because this story is not over. The northern suburbs of Atlanta always carried a kind of beauty, so meticulously maintained that it felt cold. Wide roads, perfectly trimmed lawns, and gleaming houses created a sense of flawless order, as if everything had already been sorted and categorized. There were people born to belong in a place like this, and there were others who, the moment they stepped in, were immediately recognized as out of place. Marcus Johnson understood that feeling the instant he pulled his car to a stop in front of Brewhaven. He turned off the engine, took a slow breath, then turned to look at his daughter. Mia sat in the passenger seat, both hands wrapped tightly around an empty plastic cup she had brought from home, her eyes lighting up as she looked through the cafe's large glass windows. "Dad, this place looks like it's from a movie," she said excitedly, pulling Marcus back to the present. Marcus smiled. It was a familiar smile, one he had practiced for years to reassure his daughter and himself. He reached out and gently smoothed Mia's hair. "Yeah, today is your special day." He did not say that this cafe cost several times more than the places they usually went. He did not say that the bills in his wallet had been counted and recounted all morning. He only wanted to preserve this small feeling for his daughter. An afternoon without hospitals, without the smell of medicine, without whispered conversations about insurance money. The door of Brewhaven opened, a soft bell chiming. A wave of cold air from the conditioning hit their faces, carrying the scent of roasted coffee and the familiar expensive fragrance of places not meant for people who lived on hourly wages. Marcus took Mia's hand and stepped inside. The conversations in the cafe paused for a very brief moment, not long enough to be called silence, but long enough for Marcus to notice. Men in suits lowered their voices mid-sentence. A woman in yoga clothes glanced up at them, then looked away. A few pairs of eyes flicked over them reflexively, assessing, categorizing, then pretending they had seen nothing. Marcus was far too familiar with that kind of look. It was not rude, not overt, but it always carried the same message. He did not belong here. Mia did not notice. She lifted her head and looked around, her eyes fixed on the menu board hanging high above, filled with ornate lettering. "Dad, there are so many kinds," Mia whispered, her voice full of excitement. "I like this place." Marcus nodded and gently pulled her closer. He tried to keep his steps normal, not too fast, not too slow. Inside his chest, a familiar sensation began to spread, that instinct that made his spine tense every time he entered spaces like this. Behind the counter, Chad looked up. His gaze lingered on Marcus longer than necessary, from his face to the hands holding a child's hand, then sliding down to the worn heels of his shoes. The corner of Chad's mouth curled upward into a thin, unfriendly smile. "You sure you didn't come to the wrong place?" Chad said, his tone half joking, half contemptuous, loud enough for the people near the counter to hear. Marcus gently tightened his grip on Mia's hand. He did not turn to look at Chad, nor did he respond right away. He had learned that there were things that, once answered, only made everything worse. He guided Mia one step forward, stopping in front of the menu board. "What do you want to drink?" Marcus asked quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. Mia pointed up at the board. "This one, Dad. Iced mocha." "Okay," Marcus replied, then lifted his head toward the counter. "Could I see the menu, please?" Chad did not hand over a menu. He leaned his arms on the counter, tilting forward, his eyes still locked on Marcus. "I'm not sure we've got anything here that you're used to." A few small laughs sounded somewhere behind them. It was unclear who they came from, or whether they were intentional or unconscious. Marcus felt them more sharply than the noise of the espresso machine running nearby. He turned to look at Chad for the first time. Marcus's gaze was calm, but carried the weariness of someone accustomed to being scrutinized. "We just want to order drinks," he said, choosing each word carefully. Chad shrugged, "Just giving you a heads up." Marcus turned back to Mia and bent down to her eye level. "Stand here with Dad, okay?" he said softly. Mia nodded, but her small hand tightened its grip on his shirt. She was beginning to sense the strange atmosphere, even if she did not yet understand why. Marcus took one more step forward. The space between him and the counter narrowed, but the sense of distance did not. The eyes around the cafe seemed to press into his back, waiting to see what would happen next. The way people wait for an uncomfortable scene they do not want to be part of. Chad leaned over the counter, lowering his voice, but not enough to be quiet. "So, not mopping floors today?" The words dropped into the cafe like a heavy object. They did not need emphasis, and they did not need explanation. Their meaning was unmistakably clear. Marcus stood still for the length of a single breath. He felt a subtle shift in the air, as if everyone were waiting for his reaction. He thought of Mia standing just behind him, thought of the afternoon he wanted to give her, thought of how one wrong sentence at this moment could shatter everything. He took a deep breath, turned back to his daughter, and placed a hand on Mia's shoulder. "I'll order quickly," he said, his voice low and even. Then he turned to face Chad again. "We're ordering like any other customers." Chad scoffed. That smile made no effort to hide the pleasure of knowing he had struck a nerve. He opened his mouth, about to say something more, and the entire cafe, in that brief moment, sank into a heavy silence, as if something terrible were standing right at the threshold, waiting to be spoken aloud. Marcus stood at the counter for a few more seconds, long enough to clearly feel himself becoming the center of attention that carried no goodwill. He heard the steady hum of the coffee machine behind Chad, the sound of a spoon clinking against a ceramic cup somewhere in the cafe, and even the rhythm of his own heartbeat, heavier than usual. He lowered his voice, slowly, carefully, as if every word had to be placed in exactly the right position. "A small iced mocha for my daughter. Black coffee for me." His voice was clear enough for Chad to hear, but not loud enough to be considered provocative. Marcus was accustomed to choosing the volume of every sentence, especially in places like this. Chad did not immediately turn to the computer. He looked at Marcus for another beat, then glanced down at his hand, where the bill had been taken from an old wallet. Marcus placed the $10 bill on the counter and smoothed it flat with his fingertips, an unconscious habit. It was an amount of money he had considered for a long time before deciding to step into the cafe, the limit he had set for himself to indulge his daughter on a rare occasion. Chad chuckled, not a loud laugh, but a dry sound, just enough for the people nearby to hear and understand that it was not an innocent joke. "Are you sure you can afford it?" Chad asked, raising an eyebrow, his voice carrying deliberately exaggerated skepticism. Marcus clearly sensed the shift in the atmosphere. The people standing near the counter slowed their movements. A man in a white shirt stopped stirring his coffee. A woman behind him tilted her head slightly, as if unwilling to miss what would happen next. Marcus swallowed. He looked straight at Chad. "This is the money I have," he said, his voice still kept low. "If it isn't enough, just say so." Chad tilted his head, a flicker of amusement flashing in his eyes. "We don't accept food stamps here," he said, his voice slower now, each word lightly emphasized, as if to ensure no one missed it. A few stifled giggles sounded behind them, not loud, not distinct, but enough for Marcus to realize that someone found this amusing. He did not turn around. He did not need to look to know how Mia was reacting. Her small hand tightened around his more firmly, her fingernails lightly scraping his skin, a familiar gesture whenever Mia began to feel anxious. Marcus bent down slightly and spoke softly to her. "It's okay, sweetheart." Mia looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Dad, why did he say that?" she asked, her voice so small it nearly blended into the noise of the cafe. Marcus did not answer right away. He turned back to face Chad. "We're just buying coffee," he said, this time more clearly, "like everyone else." Chad crossed his arms and leaned against the counter. He did not rush to respond. He looked Marcus up and down, then glanced at Mia, his gaze lingering for 1 second too long. "You know," Chad said, his voice turning falsely sweet, "there are places that aren't suitable for children. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He placed a hand on Mia's shoulder, a gesture meant both to reassure her and to keep himself still. "She just wants an iced coffee," Marcus said. "We'll be gone right away." Unquote. A man standing a few steps away cleared his throat, as if he wanted to say something and then thought better of it. Another person looked down at their phone. No one spoke up. The silence surrounding them was not neutral silence, but the silence of people who had chosen the more convenient side. Chad laughed again, louder this time. "Did you hear that?" he said, turning his head toward a coworker behind him. "They just want coffee." In a tess, Marcus heard the faint scrape of a chair being pulled back, indistinct whispers, but no one stepped forward. Mia began breathing faster. Marcus felt it immediately through the way her hand trembled. He bent lower, bringing his face close to hers. "Slow breaths," he whispered. "Dad's here." He turned back and looked at Chad. "Please," Marcus said. "We're in a hurry." Chad tilted his head, his eyes lighting up, not with anger, but with power. This was the moment in which he had full control over the rhythm of the situation. "How about this?" Chad said, his voice slowing, each word clear. "Take your welfare princess to McDonald's. That'd be more appropriate." The sentence fell like a knife, sharp and cold. It did not need explanation. It carried enough weight of insult for everyone in the café to understand its meaning. Marcus stood still. For a very brief moment, he felt all eyes turned toward him, some curious, some avoiding his gaze, some carrying silent judgment. Mia gasped softly. "Dad!" she called, her voice trembling. Marcus turned to her and placed both hands on her shoulders. He looked into Mia's eyes, trying to keep his voice steady. "Dad's here," he said. "You're okay." He straightened up and faced Chad again. "You've heard me already," Marcus said, each word spoken slowly. "We're just buying coffee." Chad curled his lips slightly, but said nothing more. He turned to the computer and typed a few keys, as if everything that had just happened were nothing more than a small diversion. But Marcus knew, and Mia knew, that something had been broken. Not just an ordinary afternoon, but the fragile sense of safety he had tried to preserve for his daughter throughout the entire walk into the café. And the café, in that moment, remained silent, a heavy silence, thick enough for the insults that had just been spoken to continue echoing without anyone needing to repeat them. The words that had just been spoken still hung in the air, heavy, like a layer of invisible dust. Marcus stood at the counter, feeling the skin on his face grow hot, not from shame, but from the acute awareness that he was being exposed in a crowded space where there were absolutely no allies. He clenched his fist, his knuckles tightened until they turned white, as if loosening his grip even slightly would allow years of pent-up anger to spill out. But he did not allow that to happen. Not here, not in front of Mia. "Leave us alone," Marcus said, his voice lowered until it nearly dissolved into the noise of the café. The words were not spoken to argue, but to end things. At least, that was what he hoped. Mia stepped back behind him. She was no longer standing at his side, but had pressed herself fully against his back, both hands gripping his shirt tightly. Marcus felt her trembling breath through the thin fabric. Tears fell silently, without a sound, but enough to pierce him with pain. He glanced around the café, not to seek help, but as a final human reflex when cornered. At a table near the window, a man bent over his phone, fingers swiping rapidly across the screen, so absorbed it was as if the world around him did not exist. Across the room, a woman turned away, pretending to adjust her handbag. No one met his eyes for long. Then Marcus saw an arm rise. Someone standing near the counter lifted a phone, subtly adjusting the angle. That person's eyes lit up, not with outrage or compassion, but with the cold excitement of someone who had just stumbled upon something shareable. Marcus recognized that look all too well. It did not side with Chad, nor with him. It sided only with content. No one spoke. Not a single word of protest. Not a single question. The entire café sank into a thick silence, not because they had not heard, but because they had chosen the safest option for themselves. Marcus turned back to look at Chad. Chad stood with his arms crossed over his chest, leaning casually against the counter. He did not need to say anything more. The silence of the crowd spoke for him. On Chad's face, Marcus saw clear satisfaction the victorious feeling of someone who had just realized the system was backing him. Mia's breathing began to quicken. At first, it was short, rapid breaths, then a faint wheezing sound, heartbreakingly familiar. Marcus sensed the change instantly, faster than anyone else in the cafe. He turned around, crouched low, shielding his daughter from the curious stares. "Look at Dad," he whispered, forcing his voice to stay even. "Breathe in slowly." Mia shook her head, tears spilling more freely. She raised a hand to her chest, her fingers trembling as they clutched at her father's shirt. Marcus placed one hand on her back, the other steadying her shoulder, gently rubbing in a slow rhythm, just as he had done countless times during long nights at home. "It's okay," he said, barely loud enough for the two of them to hear. "Dad's here." He felt the eyes of everyone in the room turn toward him once again. This time, it was no longer curiosity, but a cautious scrutiny, as if they were weighing whether the situation had crossed an acceptable line. Chad remained where he was, arms crossed, silent. He did not need to push further. Everything was unfolding exactly at the pace he wanted. Marcus straightened and looked directly at Chad. "We're leaving," he said, his voice low but clear. "Give me my money back." End quote. Chad shrugged, slowly picked up the bill from the counter, and slid it back toward Marcus. "Whatever you want," he replied indifferently, as though concluding a forgettable transaction. Marcus took the bill, folded it, and slipped it into his pocket. He said nothing more. Turning to Mia, he lifted her into his arms, carefully letting her head rest against his shoulder. Mia's body felt lighter than he expected, but her rapid breathing weighed heavily on him. He walked step by step toward the door. Each step passed lowered gazes, turned away faces, eyes pretending to be busy with the coffee cups in their hands. No one stopped him. No one saw him off, and no one apologized. Just as Marcus reached out and touched the door handle, a small movement at the far end of the counter caught his attention. A woman who had been standing there the entire time, composed and calm, suddenly raised her hand. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately, forming clear signs in the air. Marcus stopped. He turned his head, unsure of what he had just seen. The woman continued signing, her gaze directed straight toward the counter, then sweeping past Chad. There was no confusion or fear on her face, only a strange resolve, as if she were accustomed to being ignored and had decided not to accept it anymore. Chad frowned and turned toward her. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice edged with impatience. The woman did not respond with words. She continued signing, slower now, clearer. Marcus stood still, Mia still in his arms, her breathing gradually stabilizing a little. He watched the scene before him, feeling as though he had just stepped into a different beat of the story, one he had not yet fully grasped. The cafe fell silent once more. This time, the silence was not entirely the same. It carried a new tension, as if something, however small, had just been broken, enough to shift the axis of every gaze. Marcus did not yet know who the woman was. He also did not yet know that the moment she raised her hands to sign would pull him back to the counter, back to the center of everything, and push his life in a completely different direction. He only knew that, at this very moment, amid the cowardly silence that had engulfed the cafe, there was one single gesture that chose not to turn away. The woman standing at the end of the counter caught Marcus's attention the moment she raised her hand. Not because the gesture was forceful, but because it ran completely counter to the atmosphere that had just settled over the cafe. When everyone else chose to turn away, she chose to remain still and ask to be seen. She stepped forward one pace, keeping a measured distance from the counter. Her face was calm, her gaze focused, and her hands began to move through the air, slowly and clearly. Her fingers formed shapes familiar to those who knew the language, but to most people in the cafe, they were only strange, wordless motions. Marcus came to a full stop. He was still holding Mia in his arms, feeling her breathing gradually slow, though it was not yet steady. He looked at the woman, then at Chad, as if waiting to see where this would go. The woman continued signing, her eyes fixed straight on the counter, carrying a patience she was trying hard to preserve. She tilted her head slightly and repeated the movements, more clearly this time, as if believing that with just a little more time, she would be understood. Chad looked at her for a few seconds. He let out a short breath, shrugged, then cut her off in an irritated voice. I don't know that. Stupid language. The last word was spoken slowly, deliberately drawn out, as if to ensure his contempt did not go unnoticed. A few people in the cafe flinched. Some glances shifted toward the woman, then quickly turned away again. She frowned. The insult had clearly reached her, but instead of reacting with a burst of emotion, she drew in a breath, adjusted her posture, and continued signing. The movements were slightly faster now, more rigid, like a reminder that she did not simply disappear because she was being ignored. Chad turned his head toward the coworker behind the counter, curling his lip into a sneer. See what I mean, he said, loud enough for several nearby people to hear. It's always like this. No one replied. Chad's coworker lowered his head and returned to his work. A few customers shook their heads. Someone sighed very softly, but no one spoke up. The silence was no longer born of shock or surprise, but of habit. A habit trained by seeing enough of this to know that intervening would only make things more complicated for oneself. Marcus watched the scene, his jaw tightening until the muscles in his face went taut. He felt a surge of heat run along his spine. Not an explosive anger, but the familiar sensation of compressed helplessness. He had been ready to leave. He had accepted that he and Mia were not welcome in this place, but what he was seeing now made it impossible for him to take another step. He lowered his gaze to Mia. She was clinging tightly to his neck, her breathing still not fully steady. Her eyes were fixed on the woman, curiosity mixed with worry. "Dad, what is she doing?" the girl asked, her voice weaker than before. Marcus did not answer right away. He looked back at the woman, at the way she persisted in signing despite being cut off, at her eyes that never left the counter, as if she refused to be pushed to the margins. Chad crossed his arms and leaned against the counter. "If you can't speak," he said, his voice carrying a feigned weariness, "then you should go somewhere else." The sentence landed lightly in the cafe, but its weight was far heavier. It was not aimed only at the woman. It was aimed at anyone who did not fit the mold he believed was right. The woman remained still for one more second. Then she exhaled, slowly, and signed again, this time directing her gaze toward everyone in the cafe, not just Chad. This was no longer merely an order for a drink, but a request to have her existence acknowledged. Marcus felt his grip tighten around Mia. He realized he was standing on a very thin line. One more step toward the door, and he and his daughter would leave this place, carrying with them a familiar wound. One step back, and he would return to the center of a situation he had tried hard to avoid. He scanned the cafe once more, eyes cast downward, faces turned away. Those who had chosen silence before continued to choose silence now. He looked at Mia again. Her breathing grew a little quicker, one hand still resting on her chest. Marcus knew he did not have much time left to hesitate. The woman signed once more. Her movements were slower now, as if she were trying to regulate her own emotions, keeping everything from slipping out of control. Chad let out a quiet laugh and shook his head. "Such a waste of time," he said, turning away to grab another cup. Marcus stepped out of his place of safety. He did not know when he had made the decision. Maybe it was when he saw the look in Mia's eyes. Maybe it was when he heard Chad's voice spit out that last word. Maybe it was when he realized that if he turned away now, he would carry that feeling with him for the rest of his life. Marcus set Mia down, keeping her hand in his. "You stand here, okay?" he said softly. "Dad will be right back." Mia looked at him, her eyes wide. "What are you going to do, Dad?" "I'm just going to talk," Marcus replied, his voice low but steady. "You just keep breathing slowly." He turned back toward the counter and walked forward at an unhurried pace, slow enough for every eye to register the change. The woman noticed him approaching. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, then her gaze settled on him as if waiting for something. Chad turned back, frowning. "What do you want now?" he asked. Marcus did not answer immediately. He stood beside the woman, not too close, not too far. He looked at her hands, then lifted his eyes to meet hers. A very old memory surfaced in his mind. Evenings spent sitting beside a hospital bed, learning basic signs from a worn, printed sheet, just so he could communicate with one of Sarah's friends long ago. He drew in a breath and raised his hands. His fingers moved slowly, somewhat awkwardly, but clearly, not perfect, not fluent, but enough to form meaning. "What would you like to order?" The air in the cafe seemed to freeze. The woman looked at him, stunned for the space of a single breath. Then her eyes brightened, just slightly, like a small light being switched on in a room that had been cold and dim. Marcus kept his hands raised, ready to repeat himself if needed. He knew he had just crossed a line, and he also knew that from this moment on, the story of him and Mia would no longer follow the old path. Marcus kept his hand hovering in the air for one more beat, long enough for the woman to understand that he was not joking, nor was he hesitating. His fingers were slightly stiff, moving slowly and without smoothness, but his eyes were focused and serious. "What would you like to order?" He signed again, more carefully this time, as if afraid that even a small wrong movement could cause the other person to misunderstand. The woman froze. In that moment, her entire expression changed very clearly. The initial wariness dissolved, giving way to something like surprise, and immediately after that, an unmistakable relief. Her eyes lit up, not the kind of explosive brightness, but the warm light of someone who had just been seen after bracing herself to be ignored yet again. She took a short breath, then began to sign. Her fingers moved faster than Marcus's, decisive and clear, like someone accustomed to using this language to protect herself. "Caramel latte, almond milk." She repeated it once more, slower, to make sure he could follow. Marcus nodded. He did not need to understand every small detail to grasp the main idea. He turned his head toward Chad, who was still standing there with an impatient expression. "She's ordering a caramel latte," Marcus said evenly. "Almond milk," end quote. Chad looked at Marcus, then at the woman, his eyes darkening slightly. He said nothing for a few seconds, as if weighing whether to continue dragging the situation out. Finally, he pursed his lips and turned back to the computer. His fingers struck the keyboard harder than necessary, producing dry clacking sounds that echoed through the cafe. "Caramel latte, almond milk," Chad repeated impatiently. "Anything else?" The woman looked at Marcus and tilted her head slightly. Marcus turned toward her, waiting. She shook her head gently, then signed a short sentence. "Thank you." Marcus nodded in response, a reflex more natural than he had expected. The atmosphere in the cafe changed very slowly, but unmistakably. Eyes that had been avoiding the scene began to linger a little longer. A few people tilted their heads, their curiosity undisguised. The tension from earlier had not disappeared, but it had lost its initial sharpness. Marcus turned back toward Mia. The child stood a few steps away, her hand gripping the edge of the table near the door. Mia's breathing had slowed, but her eyes were still wide, following her father's every movement. Marcus smiled at her, a familiar, reassuring smile. When he turned back toward the counter, Marcus suddenly remembered something. A very small memory, seemingly unimportant, surfaced in his mind. One evening, many years earlier, when Sarah was still alive, he had sat at the dining table with a sheet of paper covered in clumsy sketches. Sarah had laughed as he struggled to learn a simple signed phrase, just to make her happy. The thought made the corner of Marcus's mouth lift slightly. He looked back at the woman, then raised his hand once more. His fingers moved slowly, even a bit more awkwardly than before. He signed, telling himself as he did, so that if he got it wrong, the worst that could happen was an apology. "Coffee," he began, then paused for a beat, searching for the image in his mind. "Makes me fly," he continued, lifting his hand lightly upward, like a superhero. In that moment, the entire cafe seemed to stop breathing. No one said anything. No one laughed. Even Chad stopped typing, turned his head, and frowned as if unsure what he had just witnessed. The woman looked at Marcus, stunned at first. Then her lips curved upward slightly. A very quick, very genuine smile flashed across her face before she could control it. Her shoulders shook gently, and then she laughed. Not a loud laugh, but a soundless one, yet clear and complete. Her face lit up, as if another source of light had just been switched on in the room. She raised a hand to cover her mouth out of reflex, then laughed again, this time without hiding it. A few people in the cafe began to smile as well, hesitant at first, then more naturally. A woman near the window let out a long breath, as if releasing something heavy. A man standing near the counter shook his head slightly, smiling. Marcus stood still, his hand still suspended in the air. He had not expected that clumsy signed sentence to create such a reaction. He only knew that, in this moment, the heavy feeling that had blanketed the cafe since he walked in was gradually dissolving. Mia saw the woman laughing. The child blinked, then smiled, to a small but bright smile. Marcus realized that his daughter's breathing had become steadier. The hand resting on Mia's chest was no longer clenched as tightly as before. Chad cleared his throat softly and turned back to the computer. "All right," he said, his voice lower than before. "2 drinks. Go sit and wait." Marcus nodded. He turned to the woman and signed a short sentence, apologizing if he had done it wrong. She shook her head, her eyes still shining with joy, then signed back, thanking him. They stood next to each other for a few more seconds without speaking. This silence was completely different. It was not heavy or oppressive, but more like a necessary pause after prolonged tension. Marcus turned back toward Mia and took her hand. "Are you okay now?" he asked. Mia nodded. She laughed. The child said, relieved, "I like her." Marcus smiled. He said nothing more, but in his heart he knew that what had just happened was not merely a fleeting moment of kindness. It had revealed something no one in the cafe had wanted to face before, that with just one very small action, the invisible wall built between people could begin to crack. The woman was still smiling, occasionally lifting her hands to sign a few small gestures, as if replaying the joke from moments earlier. Her eyes swept past Marcus, paused for a beat, carrying unspoken gratitude. And in that moment, in the middle of a cafe that had once been filled with a toxic atmosphere, something truly changed. The woman's smile did not stop at the first moment. At first, it was only a very small reflex, her lips curving upward, her eyes narrowing in surprise. Then, her shoulders trembled slightly, as if her body had not yet adjusted to the sensation of being released from a long-held pressure. Laughter did not burst out as sound, but it was clearly present, spreading from her face, from her eyes, from the way she raised a hand to cover her mouth and then lowered it again, unable to hide her joy. Marcus stood still, watching that moment unfold before his eyes. He had never thought that such an awkward gesture of his could create a reaction like that. In his mind, everything seemed to move very slowly, as if time inside the cafe had just been stretched by a few extra seconds. The woman continued to smile. This time, the smile was clearer, more complete. She tilted her head toward Marcus, her eyes shining with gratitude that needed no words. Her hand moved quickly through the air, signing a short sentence, and then she laughed again, as if she herself were surprised by her own emotions. A few customers in the cafe began to look at one another. Confusion was written plainly on their faces. A woman sitting near the window raised her eyebrows, then turned to her friend and said something in a lowered voice. A man waiting for his drink let out a small breath, as if he had just realized he had been holding it for too long. No one was giggling anymore. No one was showing amusement at someone else's discomfort. Chad stood behind the counter, his hand resting on the keyboard, but he did not type another character. The crooked smile he had worn earlier was gone. His face was blank for a few seconds, then shifted into an obvious look of irritation. He looked at the woman, looked at Marcus, then scanned the cafe, as if trying to reclaim the sense of control that had slipped from his grasp. "Your drinks will be ready shortly," Chad said, his voice shorter than before, lacking its usual sarcasm. Marcus did not reply. He turned his head to look for Mia. The girl was standing next to a table near the door, her hand still gripping the edge of the table, but her face was different. Mia was watching the smiling woman, her curious gaze turning into delight. When Marcus saw the faint smile appear on his daughter's lips, he felt an invisible weight in his chest soften. Mia lifted a hand to her chest and took a longer breath than before. Her breathing slowed, becoming steadier. Marcus stepped closer and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay now?" he asked softly. Mia nodded. "I like her," the girl said, her voice small but clear. "She smiles like in the stories." Marcus smiled as well. He realized that the atmosphere around him had changed, not in a loud or sudden way, but as if a thin layer of mist had just lifted, revealing a room that had been there all along. The cafe no longer felt as cold as it had when he first walked in. The sound of the coffee machine seemed lighter. Footsteps moving around the cafe were no longer hesitant. A few people returned to their unfinished conversations, but their voices were different, less tense. The woman was still smiling. She turned to Marcus and signed another sentence, more slowly than before. Marcus understood most of it. She was saying that she was used to being ignored, but this moment reminded her that there were still people willing to stop and try to understand. Marcus responded with a nod. "I just did what anyone should do," he said, then suddenly realized that she could not hear him. He smiled and shrugged instead of speaking. Chad placed 2 cups of drinks on the counter. The iced mocha was pushed toward Marcus first, followed by the almond milk caramel latte. He did not look directly at anyone while doing so. "Call if you need anything," Chad said, his voice dry. Marcus stepped forward and placed his hand on the counter. "Thank you," he said, his tone polite, neither challenging nor weak. Chad did not respond. Marcus handed the mocha to Mia first. The girl took it, smelled it briefly, then took a small sip. The smile on her lips became more distinct. Marcus turned to the woman and gently pushed the latte toward her. She accepted it, her eyes still glowing with joy that had not yet faded. They stood next to each other for a while without speaking. This silence was completely different from the silences before. It carried no pressure, instead resembling a natural pause, a space in which everyone in the cafe sensed that something had just been set right, even though no one could name it. Marcus looked around. A few people met his gaze, then quickly looked away, not out of contempt, but out of embarrassment. A man near the door gave him a slight nod, a very small gesture, but enough for Marcus to realize that not everyone had chosen to turn away. He bent down to Mia's eye level. "Drink slowly," he reminded her. "I'll go get some napkins." Mia nodded, her hand still holding the cup tightly. Her breathing was steady, no longer rushed like before. Marcus straightened up, his heart feeling a little lighter, as if he had just set down a burden he had been carrying since the moment he entered the cafe. In another corner of Brewhaven, a customer was still holding a phone in their hand. The screen was lit, recording the scene that had just taken place. That person adjusted the angle, their hand trembling slightly with excitement. In the frame, the woman's smile was still there. Marcus stood beside his daughter, and the cafe looked far more peaceful than it had just a few minutes earlier. Marcus did not see that phone. He was focused on Mia, on the cup of coffee in her hands, on the rare feeling that he had just done the right thing. But the camera continued to record, and no one in the cafe knew that from this moment on, the story would no longer remain within the 4 walls of Brewhaven. That video clip, depending on how it was edited, could become proof of kindness or become a weapon turned back against the very person who had stood up. Just one act of kindness had shifted the entire room, and the price Marcus would have to pay for that moment was still waiting for him ahead. The call from Sterling Enterprises came the next morning, brief and cold. Marcus had just dropped Mia off at school when his phone vibrated. A familiar voice came through. No greeting, no lengthy explanation, only a demand that he be present at the management office within 1 hour. Marcus understood immediately what that meant. Yesterday's video had left Brewhaven, and it had not gone alone. The management office was on the 2nd floor, at the far end of the hallway. Marcus had walked down this corridor countless times over many years, working as a janitor, but this was the first time he entered it as someone whose name had been summoned. The room was clean and bright, everything arranged with an almost emotionless neatness. The manager sat behind the desk, leaning forward, one hand already resting on a tablet. Marcus had not even sat down when the tablet was tossed, lightly but decisively, onto the desk between them. The screen lit up. The video played again. The familiar angle. The coffee counter. Part of the scene had been cut away. What remained was only the image of Marcus, standing at the counter, his hand movements slightly larger than normal, his face tense. There were no insults from Chad. No moment of signing, no smile. "Explain," the manager said, his tone flat, neither raised nor lowered. Marcus looked at the screen for a few seconds, then looked up. "This video isn't complete," he said. "They edited it. What happened wasn't like that." The manager waved a hand, cutting him off. "Sterling doesn't operate on emotions," he replied. "We operate on images and risk." Marcus took a breath, keeping his voice steady. "My daughter was there. She has asthma. I was just trying to help someone else order a drink. Someone in the cafe filmed it, but they left out everything that happened before. And well." The manager leaned back in his chair, looking at Marcus the way one looks at a technical problem that needs solving. "Do you know how fast this video is spreading?" he asked. "Customers don't care who you were helping. All they see is a Sterling employee causing trouble in one of our cafes." "I wasn't causing trouble," Marcus said, his voice lower. "I did what a human being should do." The manager shrugged. "That's not what we're discussing." "I can." Marcus placed both hands on his thighs, his fingers interlaced. "If I lose my job," he said slowly, I lose my insurance too. My daughter needs medication every month. I've worked here for many years. The manager looked at him for another beat. No one forced you to have a child, he said. The company is not responsible for your personal choices. The words landed lightly, but Marcus felt as if something had been slammed straight into his chest. He stayed silent for a few seconds, then spoke again. So, all you need is an edited video to decide someone's fate? The manager did not answer directly. You are a public relations risk, he said. That is the only thing that matters in this case. Marcus lifted his gaze. What about the truth? The manager stood up, walked around the desk, and opened the office door. The truth isn't always convenient, he replied. You, of all people, should understand that. Marcus rose on instinct. He stepped into the hallway, but before the door closed, the manager called after him. Prepare yourself, his voice echoed behind him. You're about to be fired. The office door slammed shut. The sound echoed in Marcus's mind long afterward. He stood still in the hallway for several seconds, looking down at his hands, the hands that had scrubbed floors, that had carried his daughter, that had clumsily signed in the café the day before. Everything suddenly felt more fragile than ever. Marcus turned and walked slowly toward the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last. In his mind, there was no longer the image of the café or the woman's smile. There was only Mia, the bottles of medicine lined up on the shelf, and the sentence that still rang clearly in his head. Sterling does not operate on emotions. The system had chosen the strong, and today, Marcus was not among them. Night descended over the small apartment on the outskirts of Atlanta, slowly, as if it, too, were hesitating before covering everything. Marcus sat beside Mia's bed, his back against the wall, both hands resting on his knees, motionless. The nightlight cast a weak yellow glow, not enough to dispel the heavy feeling lingering in the room. Mia lay on her side, her small face slightly pale. Each breath she took sounded clearly in the quiet space, short and rapid, like repeated knocks against Marcus's chest. He leaned closer, listening to every breath, as if simply listening carefully enough might make everything ease. I'm here, he said softly, even though Mia was drifting in and out of sleep and might not hear him. On the small table beside the bed, the asthma inhaler lay tipped over, its cap not fully tightened. Marcus reached for it and gave it a gentle shake. The hollow sound rang out, thin and cold. He looked inside, as if still hoping to find one last remaining dose. There was none. Marcus set the inhaler down, carefully, as though afraid of making any sound louder than necessary. He took a deep breath, but the air in the room seemed to thicken inside his lungs. The numbers he had calculated and recalculated throughout the day began to surface in his mind. Tomorrow, next week, insurance, a new prescription. His phone lay on the sofa a few steps away. The screen lit up and went dark repeatedly, notification after notification. Marcus glanced toward it, then looked away. He did not need to open it to know what was inside. At last, he stood up, stepped quietly out of the bedroom, and pulled the door closed just enough to keep the light from spilling out. He sat down on the sofa and picked up his phone. Social media was flooded with images from Brewhaven. The same video clip, the same camera angle, the same distorted story. His face appeared on the screen, boxed in by cropped captions. Janitor causes disturbance at upscale coffee shop. Exactly the type who doesn't know his place. People like this don't deserve to exist. Marcus read each line, not out of curiosity, but because he could not avoid it. Every sentence felt like a shove, pushing him farther away from the world he had tried so hard to hold on to. Some people demanded that Sterling fire him immediately. Some called him a threat. Others said he should know his position. He scrolled past a long comment, then stopped. The person wrote that if it had been them, they would have called security from the start. Marcus stared at those words for a moment, then locked the screen. He set the phone down and covered his face with both hands. A sigh escaped him, heavy and exhausted. In that moment, he felt as if the small apartment were closing in around him, each wall moving a little closer. Marcus looked up when he heard Mia cough softly in the bedroom. He sprang to his feet and returned to her bedside. Mia shifted, her forehead damp with sweat, her breathing quickening again. Marcus sat down, placed a hand on her back, and gently patted in the familiar rhythm. "Slow breaths," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly despite his effort to stay calm. Mia opened her eyes and looked at him. "Dad," she said, her voice hoarse, "I can't breathe well." Marcus leaned closer, his forehead lightly touching hers. "I know," he said. "I'm here." He glanced back at the inhaler on the table, then at Mia. A sense of helplessness surged up, sharp and cold. He had faced brutal matches on the football field, endured pain without complaint, but nothing had prepared him for the moment of watching his own child struggle to breathe with nothing in his hands. After a while, Mia's breathing eased slightly. She drifted back into a shallow sleep. Marcus remained there for a long time, until he was sure her breathing had stabilized. He returned to the sofa and picked up his phone again, this time intending to search for the number of some charity, anywhere that might help him hold on for a few more days. The screen lit up. A new notification appeared. The sending account had no profile picture, no information, just a single short line. "Meet me at Piedmont Park, 10 a.m. Marcus frowned. He read the message again, then read it once more. There were no additional details, no explanation. Beneath the line was a single character, E. Marcus leaned back against the sofa, staring at the screen. His heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from a vague, familiar feeling. An image suddenly surfaced in his mind. The silent smile at Brewhaven, the calm gaze of the woman who had raised her hand in a signal when everyone else had looked away. He whispered, almost unaware that he was speaking aloud. "Elena?" The apartment sank back into silence. Only Mia's steady breathing drifted from the bedroom, and the pale blue glow of the phone screen reflected across Marcus's face. He did not know whether the message was a trap. He did not know what the sender wanted from him. But on the longest night of his life, when every door seemed to have closed, that brief line of text felt like a narrow crack, just wide enough for light to slip through. Marcus set the phone down and looked toward the bedroom once more. He knew that tomorrow morning he would go to Piedmont Park, because he had no other choice. The morning at Piedmont Park unfolded with its familiar sense of calm, the kind of calm that easily makes people believe everything in the world is functioning exactly as it should. Sunlight filtered through the canopy of old oak trees, spilling onto the ground in mottled patches. Joggers passed by. Dog walkers strolled at an unhurried pace, other lives moving on as if unaware that in one corner of the park, a man was standing before a truth that could tear apart what remained of his life. Marcus arrived early. He stood beneath an oak tree, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, his palms damp with sweat. He had barely slept the night before. Images of Mia gasping for breath, an empty asthma inhaler, and the edited video took turns replaying in his mind. And then there was the message, brief, cold, signed with only a single letter. He had asked himself whether he was crazy to come here, but then he thought of the silent smile in the café, thought of the calm gaze of the woman who had not turned away when everyone else had. Footsteps sounded behind him, making Marcus turn around. Elena stood there, a few steps away. She did not look rushed, nor did she seem furtive. She nodded in greeting, her composure so steady that it made Marcus uneasy. She gestured toward a wooden bench beneath the tree. They sat facing each other, surrounded by the rustling wind and the everyday sounds of the park, like two strangers about to tell a story that was anything but ordinary. Elena took out her phone first. She opened the notes application, typed a few lines, then turned the screen toward Marcus. The words appeared clearly, without embellishment, without explanation. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Sterling." Marcus stared at the screen for several seconds, then let out a laugh. It was dry, short, and echoed oddly in the quiet space. "Are you joking with me?" he said, his voice weary. "After everything that just happened, do you really think I am calm enough to hear something like that?" Elena did not react. She waited until the laughter faded completely, then typed again. This time, she turned the screen more slowly, as if she knew these words would be harder to swallow. "But I do not hold the power." Marcus looked up, fixing his gaze on her. "What do you mean?" he asked. "What is the point of being a chief executive officer without authority?" Elena exhaled slowly, then began to explain, typing as she spoke, occasionally glancing at Marcus to make sure he was still following. Sterling Enterprises, according to her, did not operate the way outsiders believed. The board of directors was where real power resided, and the person at the head of that board was Harlan Crow. The name rang in Marcus's mind like metal, striking metal. He had heard of the man before through hallway stories, through whispers from former workers, someone who rarely appeared in public, yet whose influence seeped everywhere. Elena continued, Brewhaven was not merely a coffee chain. It was part of a testing system where Sterling measured the reactions of employees, customers, and society itself. Who stayed silent, who spoke up, who was removed. And while attention focused on those small, visible conflicts, more dangerous things were hidden behind them. Industrial chemicals, Elena said aloud this time, her voice low and firm. Mixed, falsely labeled, pushed onto the market without proper inspection. Marcus felt his throat go dry. Old images surged back without warning. Sarah coming home late, exhausted, her coat carrying the scent of the laboratory, half-finished conversations, moments when she hesitated and then fell silent, words that sounded as though she were testing his reaction. Sarah, Marcus said, his wife's name slipping from his lips. She worked in a lab. Elena looked at him without avoiding his gaze. She nodded. She discovered it before I did, Elena said, and she was going to report it. The words made Marcus clench his fists. Memories of the stark white hospital room, of cold intravenous tubes, of Sarah's hair gradually falling out, rose so vividly that he had to turn away for a moment just to breathe. They said it was cancer, he said quietly. Only 6 months. Elena was silent for a moment, then continued carefully. There was no direct proof that someone had acted deliberately, but there were far too many similar cases. Workers, residents living near the plants, people who dared to ask questions, deaths that came quickly and cleanly. Marcus turned back to her. So everything that happened to me, he said, the cafe, the video, being pushed out, was all part of that plan? Elena shook her head. She said it was not her plan. She had pretended to be deaf to test discriminatory culture, to see what Sterling was becoming under Harlan's control. Marcus was a variable she had not anticipated, a variable that knocked everything off its safe trajectory. Marcus remained silent for a long time. He looked down at the ground, where dry leaves lay layered atop one another. So, why are you looking for me now? He asked. I have nothing left to lose. Elena met his gaze directly, without evasion. She said she needed him not because he was strong, but because he was invisible within that system. A janitor could move through places others would never be noticed. Warehouses, storage areas, spaces Harlan believed were secure. Marcus stood up, walked a few steps, then turned back. If I do this, he said, I lose my job. I lose my insurance. What about my daughter? Elena stood as well, keeping just enough distance. She said that if he did nothing, everything would continue, as it always had. Children like Mia would keep breathing in things they should never have to breathe. People like Sarah would keep disappearing. Marcus turned away, looking toward the distant lake. A light breeze rippled the surface into small circles. He thought of Mia, of the nights when she could not breathe. He thought of Sarah, of everything she had tried to say, but never had the chance to finish. The truth is not for the weak, Marcus murmured, as if reminding himself. Elena did not argue. She simply said one final thing, slowly, each word clear, like an offer, and also like a sentence. I need you to be an insider. In 11. If you knew your wife did not die from illness, would you remain silent or tear everything apart? Comment with your choice and follow the next part. Marcus stood there beneath the old oak trees, understanding that from this moment on, the road ahead would no longer have room for familiar safety. They left the area near the oak tree, where the recent conversation had pushed Marcus beyond the last boundary of his safety. Elena led him deeper into the park, toward a row of old wooden benches hidden behind a line of low trees. There, the sound of people thinned out, leaving only the wind moving through the leaves and the sensation that the outside world had temporarily lost sight of them. Elena sat down first. She did not waste time circling the issue. A tablet was placed on her lap, its screen lighting up, cold light reflecting off her face. Marcus immediately saw the file's already open pages of documents, dense with text and numbers, broken up by large sections, almost completely blacked out. This is everything I could get without being detected, Elena said, her voice low but firm. Marcus leaned in to look more closely. The headings were alarming in their implications. Chemical compositions, production batches, safety reports, but every critical detail had been erased. These are only suspicions, he said slowly. There's nothing here strong enough to convict anyone. Elena nodded. Exactly. They're enough for me to know that something is wrong, but not enough to force Harlan into the light. Marcus straightened. So, what do you need from me? Elena did not answer immediately. She locked the screen, set the tablet aside, and looked directly at him. "The warehouse," she said. Marcus frowned. "The warehouse," end quote. "The place where you work every night," Elena continued. "Where the chemical batches are stored before distribution. The place people like Harlan believe no one pays attention to." Marcus leaned back against the bench and crossed his arms. "Those areas are restricted," he said. "Not just anyone can get in. Only you can," Elena replied at once. "You're the janitor. You're there every day. You mop floors, collect trash, walk through doors that others treat as if they don't exist. You're invisible to them." That word silenced Marcus. He remembered the feeling of standing at the edge of meetings, eyes on the floor, while major decisions were made right above his head. Invisible, exactly as Elena said. And that invisibility was precisely what made him the only person suited for this role. "Elena," Marcus said, "you're asking me to take chemical samples." "Yes," she replied. "Real samples, not paperwork, not internal reports, the thing they're trying to hide." On cries. Marcus exhaled slowly, heavily. "And while I'm doing that, what will you do?" Elena turned the tablet back on. This time, the screen showed a video from Brewhaven, but not the version Marcus had seen online. The clip was longer, complete. Marcus saw the beginning, where Chad started the insults, where the crowd turned away, where the woman raised her hands to sign, and where he himself stepped forward to help. "I'll release everything," Elena said. "The original version. No cuts, no editing." Marcus stared at the image of himself on the screen. "You'll turn me into the focal point," he said. "They'll put everything on me." "I know," Elena replied, "but it's the only way to drag public attention toward Sterling. When the discrimination story explodes, when the company is put under a microscope, Harlan will be forced to go on the defensive. And then we release the real evidence." Marcus turned away, looking toward the path where a few people were strolling. "If I fail," he said, his voice dropping, "I lose my job. I lose my insurance. What about my daughter?" Elena did not avoid the question. "If you fail," she said, "I lose my seat, and Harlan will move faster, harder, to crush everything." Marcus turned back. "Chad and the manager," he said. "They're his people. They'll watch my every move." Elena nodded. "I know." That short answer made Marcus let out a hollow laugh. "So, you still want me to do this, even knowing the risk?" "Asses," with a deferent. "Because you're already a target," Elena said. "From the moment that video surfaced, you were no longer outside this. Whether you act or not, Harlan already sees you as a liability." Marcus fell silent. The words were brutal, but logical. He had learned long ago that a system does not need a perfect excuse, only a convenient one. "This is a path with no return," Elena added slowly. "Once you enter the warehouse with that intention, there is no going back to your old life." Is 11. Marcus lowered his head. His hands rested on his knees, clenched tight. In his mind, Sarah appeared again, words left unspoken, secrets never fully told. Then Mia, with her labored breathing at night and the nearly empty medicine bottle on the table. He took out his phone. The screen lit up, showing a photo of Mia smiling, her eyes curved in the sunlight. Marcus looked at it for a long time, as if trying to memorize every line, every expression, in case everything changed tomorrow. His finger brushed the screen lightly, pausing on his daughter's face. "If this goes wrong," he said, his voice hoarse, "I'll lose my child." Elena looked at him. Her gaze did not soften, but it grew deeper. "If this goes right," she said, "you'll save a lot of people, including your daughter." Marcus locked the screen and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He took a deep breath, then lifted his head to look at Elena. There was no hesitation left in his eyes, only the heavy acceptance of someone who fully understood the price to be paid. He nodded. Elena said nothing more. She simply nodded in return, as if they both understood that from this moment on, they had traded truth for life, and neither of them had the right to turn back again. Night settled over the industrial zone on the outskirts of Atlanta in a heavy, sluggish way. The warehouse of Sterling Enterprises stood apart, a massive concrete block submerged in the sickly yellow glow of industrial lights. Marcus parked his car some distance away, turned off the engine, and sat still for a few more seconds, listening to his own heartbeat. With every breath, he clearly sensed the smell of metal and chemicals mixed into the night air, so familiar that it made his scalp tighten. He stepped out of the car, pulled the hood of his jacket a little lower, and walked toward the warehouse door. The key card in his hand swept across the reader, producing a dry beep. The heavy door opened, revealing a vast, deep space where neon lights hanging from the ceiling flickered unevenly, forming alternating patches of light and shadow like the unstable rhythm of his own breathing. The warehouse was silent. There were no voices, only the sound of Marcus's footsteps echoing across the cold concrete floor. Tall rows of metal shelves stretched into the darkness, stacked with large drums and cardboard boxes. He had cleaned this place hundreds of times, but he had never looked at it with the feeling he had now. Every step carried the awareness that he was crossing an invisible boundary. Marcus stopped in front of a row of shelves at the far end of the warehouse. According to his memory, this was the least inspected area, where shipments were often stored overnight before being transferred. He placed his hand on a large cardboard box, feeling the cold, stiff paper beneath his palm. He used a box cutter and sliced a neat line. The lid opened. Inside were gray plastic canisters, neatly arranged. Marcus took one out and turned it slightly. The label on the outside clearly listed safe ingredients, the familiar symbols of industrial cleaning products. But when he flipped it to the back, a small detail made his stomach tighten. The label had been layered over another one. The edge of the paper did not align properly, as if someone had hastily tried to cover up what lay beneath. Marcus carefully peeled away the outer label. Another symbol was revealed. It was not listed in the official product catalog. A chemical code he had once seen in Sarah's old documents, the pages she used to hide in the kitchen drawer, stating that it was something that should never appear outside a sealed laboratory. "That's it," Marcus whispered, his voice turning hoarse. He opened another box, and then another. All of them were the same. Fake labels, concealed contents, a complete system, not an isolated mistake. Marcus crouched lower as the neon lights above flickered, emitting a faint buzzing sound. He spotted a thin stack of papers wedged between two boxes, hastily printed internal notes, small, dense text. He flipped through a few pages quickly, his heart pounding harder as he read the familiar lines. "Cover up to avoid environmental inspections. It's so. Do not transfer to sampling areas. Handle internally." Those cold words made Marcus's throat feel painfully dry. He coughed once, then again. The air in the warehouse seemed to thicken, the chemical smell sharper than he remembered. Each breath felt like it was scraping the inside of his chest. He raised a hand to his mouth, trying to breathe slowly. Another image forced its way into his mind. Mia sitting on her bed, one hand pressed to her chest, struggling to draw each breath in the night. Marcus closed his eyes for a second, a sharp wave of guilt rising within him. He had cleaned this place, breathed this air, and then gone home, carrying all those invisible things back to his daughter. Sarah had stood here once. The thought struck him, and Marcus opened his eyes. He remembered the times Sarah came home, with the smell of the laboratory clinging to her clothes, remembered how she grew quieter than usual, remembered the look in her eyes whenever she heard that someone at the company had quit for health reasons. She had tried to say something, many times, and then stopped. Marcus crouched down and opened the crossbody bag at his side. He took out a small glass vial, the kind used for sampling. His hand trembled slightly, but his movements remained precise. He opened the cap of one chemical canister, and the sharp stench rushed out, forcing him to turn his face away for a moment. When he turned back, he poured a sufficient amount into the vial, sealed it tightly, and wiped the outside clean with a paper towel. The sample vial rested neatly in his bag, heavy like a sentence being passed. Marcus straightened up and took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He was about to close the box and return everything to its original position. But at that exact moment, the entire warehouse flared with light. The sound of a switch flipping echoed sharply through the vast space. The neon lights stopped flickering, shining directly down on the row of shelves where Marcus stood. He froze, his heart seeming to stop for a brief beat. Footsteps echoed from the direction of the entrance, slow, deliberate. Marcus turned his head. From the darkness between the shelves, a figure stepped forward. It was the manager. The man's face was clearly visible under the lights, cold and terrifyingly calm. In his hand was a handgun, the metallic surface reflecting the pale white light. "What do you think you're doing?" the manager said, his voice steady, not needing to be loud. Marcus remained motionless. The bag at his side felt unbearably heavy, as if it were dragging him down. The space around him narrowed until there was only the light, the chemical containers, and the shadow of the past standing directly in front of him. A second figure appeared behind the manager, stepping out of the darkness between the shelves as if this place had always belonged to him. Harlan Crow was in no hurry. He walked slowly, his leather shoes striking the concrete floor in a steady rhythm, the warehouse lights casting down on a wrinkled face that was alert to the point of coldness. His gaze stopped on Marcus, then slid down to the bag at Marcus's side. "What a shame," Harlan said, his voice deep and low, not loud, yet still overpowering. "I thought you were just a pawn who knew how to keep quiet." Marcus did not step back. His heart was pounding violently, but his body remained steady. "Sarah thought the same," Harlan continued, the corner of his mouth curling into a venomous smile. "She thought she was smart, thought the truth would save someone." The words stabbed straight into Marcus. Blood rushed to his ears, a ringing sound drowning out everything around him. "What did you do to her?" Marcus asked, his voice gone hoarse. Harlan chuckled softly. "I didn't kill her," he said. "I just let her be exposed long enough to the things she was curious about. The rest, the human body took care of on its own." The manager tightened his grip on the gun, but Harlan raised one finger, signaling him to stop. "No need," he said. "Let me talk to him." End quote. In that moment, Marcus charged forward. It was not a calculated strike, but his entire body surging ahead, carrying everything that had been compressed inside him for years. He slammed straight into Harlan, sending him stumbling. The manager jerked in surprise, the gun swinging off target. The sound of metal crashing against a shelf rang out sharply. Harlan tried to regain his balance, but he was too late. He fell hard, his back slamming into the chemical shelves behind him. A dry, cracking sound echoed, followed by the consecutive shattering of glass. Bottles of chemicals fell to the floor, bursting apart, dark liquid spilling out and rising into a murky cloud of smoke. The chemical stench rushed straight into Marcus's lungs. He coughed violently, his eyes burning. The air inside the warehouse became suffocating in an instant. The manager panicked and stumbled backward several steps, but still tried to raise the gun. Marcus did not stop. He rolled to the side, grabbed a large shipping crate, and hauled it upright as a shield. Toxic smoke swirled around them, blocking visibility. He heard Harlan cursing, the manager shouting, all of it blending with the piercing wail of an alarm that suddenly erupted. Elena appeared at the warehouse entrance. She rushed into the smoke, phone in hand, activating the industrial zone's emergency alarm system. Red lights flashed throughout the warehouse, merging with the relentless sirens. Elena spotted Marcus behind the crate, then saw Harlan struggling to get back up. She raised her hand, signing quickly and decisively, her movements sharp like a military command. "Hold him!" Marcus understood instantly. He dropped the crate and charged toward Harlan again. Harlan had barely gotten to his feet when Marcus slammed him back down. The two grappled on the concrete floor, slick with chemicals. Harlan thrashed, trying to reach for something, but Marcus pinned him down, using his full body weight to keep him there. "That's enough!" Marcus roared, not knowing whether he was speaking to Harlan or to his own past. "This ends here." The sound of police sirens came from afar, growing closer by the second. The manager panicked and tried to flee toward the back door, but he had not gone far before being cut off by flashing red and blue lights flooding into the warehouse. The police stormed in, gas masks covering their faces. They quickly restrained the manager, then moved toward Marcus. Harlan was handcuffed, his face twisted with rage and fear. He looked at Marcus one last time, his eyes no longer arrogant, filled only with raw hatred. As Harlan was dragged away, Marcus collapsed onto the warehouse floor, his back against a shelf. The toxic smoke was gradually drawn out. He was gasping for breath, his lungs burning, but inside his mind, a strange emptiness opened up. Sarah, Mia, everything was finally no longer buried in darkness. Elena stepped closer and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. She did not speak. She simply looked at him, her eyes heavy yet steady. Marcus nodded to her, a very small nod, enough for both of them to understand that they had reached the end of this road. The truth does not need violence, only someone brave enough to hold on to it until the end. Follow along to see what justice returned to Marcus and Mia. Several months later, the sky over Atlanta was softly gray. Marcus stood before Sarah's gravestone, his hand resting on the cold stone. Mia stood beside him, a little thinner but healthier, her inhaler tucked neatly into her pocket, no longer the nightly source of dread. On the gravestone, Marcus had engraved a simple line: Sarah Johnson, the one who spoke first. Justice came late, but it came. Elena stood a few steps away, not disturbing the private moment. When Marcus turned back, she signed a sentence slowly, not with blood, but with truth. Marcus looked at the headstone one more time, then at Mia. He understood that those who are trampled do not need to become more ruthless to win. They only need to stand upright, hold the truth firmly, and pull it into the light. Even systems that seem untouchable will collapse on their own. The wind swept through the cemetery, carrying the scent of wet grass. Marcus took his daughter's hand and turned away. Justice had arrived, and this time it was no longer silent. Some stories do not end at the moment the villain is handcuffed, but only truly close when the truth is preserved intact, not twisted, not buried, ever again. Marcus did not become a hero because he was stronger than the system, or because he won through violence. He was simply a father who chose to stand tall when every safe path demanded that he bow his head. A small choice, but enough to pull the truth into the light and make an entire structure that seemed untouchable begin to shake. If you have ever been looked down upon because of where you came from, ever stayed silent out of fear of losing the only thing you had, then this story does not belong only to Marcus, but reflects you somewhere in your own life as well. Follow the channel to continue walking alongside stories where the truth is hidden, where kindness is tested, and where it takes only one person who refuses to turn away for an entire system to fall. Subscribe so you do not miss the next episodes, because justice does not appear on its own. It comes only when someone dares to hold on to it until the very end.